Binion is guilty, Prochorus claims, of using explicatory method as final solution, a charge that goes beyond calling Binion revisionist or an apologist for Hitler. It is tantamount to identifying Binion as Hitler, both of them executors of a horrific final solution, with Binion as what Prochorus calls, in a final epithet, a paper Eichmann. And so I shouldn't have been surprised, I suppose, when it turned out that, in person, Landsmann proved as combative and intemperate on the subject as the buzzsaw prose he and his disciples use to assault those who dare to ask why. It was an ill-starred encounter in several respects, beginning with what in retrospect seems like a symbolic misunderstanding over the codes. Landsmann's assistant had written me, in reply to my request for an interview, suggesting that I contact Landsmann when I reached Paris. After several days of missed connections, Landsmann instructed me to meet him in his office at 7 p.m. one evening. But when I arrived there, a little early, I found a darkened building. There were no names identifying the 24 or so buttons on the intercom, and Landsmann had not given me an apartment number. The outer door was locked. There was a numbered and lettered keypad beneath the buzzers that, I later learned, was used to punch in the access code to the building lobby. I stared up at the unlit windows above me, and wondering if I'd gotten the address wrong, then repaired to a nearby brasserie to call Landsmann. I reached only an answering machine, left a message about my problem, and returned to the building to see if Landsmann might have been waiting downstairs to let me in, thereby missing my call. Still no sign of life, much less of Landsmann. I returned to the brasserie to call, reached the answering machine again, repeated the fruitless trek several times for a full half-hour, until finally I left a despairing message on Landsmann's machine, apologizing for any misunderstanding, and telling him I was returning to my hotel, a good distance away in another district. Trudging unhappily through the streets in search of a taxi, I ducked into a laundromat and decided to give Landsmann one more call. This time Landsmann answered, but in a belligerent, annoyed voice asked me where I'd been, insisted he'd been waiting for me. I said I'd been waiting outside the building but didn't know how to get in. "But I gave you the codes," he said, meaning the access code. "No," I said truthfully. "You didn't give me the codes." "I gave you the codes," he insisted. When I asked him if I could come up and talk to him anyway, he said no, now it was too late. "But," I pleaded, "I'd come all the way to Paris just to see him." Finally, he relented, gave me the codes and the apartment number, and I headed back. Later, after the interview had concluded and I had a chance to wonder about what went wrong, something odd about Landsmann's version of the misunderstanding occurred to me. If he'd been waiting there for me, why hadn't he picked up the phone during the repeated calls I'd made, over a half-hour period, when I reached only his answering machine? And why did he only pick up the phone and answer after I'd left a message that I was leaving the district and returning to my hotel? It's a minor thing. I've done it myself to avoid encounters. And it's possible that he really did think that he gave me the codes, but I found the episode puzzling, particularly in light of what seemed like a continuing hostility when I finally arrived. Out of breath and a bit flustered, I sat in one of the chairs across from Landsmann's desk, put my overcoat on an adjacent chair, and trying to make the most of the time remaining, hastily slotted a cassette into my tape recorder. Before I could begin, Landsmann stopped me and ordered me to remove the overcoat from the chair and take it out of sight into another room. I complied without asking the forbidden why. Perhaps Landsmann was trying to establish an atmosphere of "here there is no why," his primal commandment against explanation. Later, I came to think of our exchange about the codes as emblematic of Landsmann's commanding voice of Sinai attitude toward all other discourse on the Holocaust. I gave you the codes in Shoah. After the giving of the codes, all other attempts to gain access to the mystery are fruitless at best, obscene at worst. And to ask why such attempts must be called obscene, as I did that evening, is to compound the obscenity. I suspect that in addition to the contretemps over the codes, my encounter with Landsman might have gotten off on the wrong foot because my first question involved the use of the word obscenity, and veered directly into an uneasy discussion of that evening in 1990 when Landsman tried to silence the Auschwitz survivor. "You have spoken of the obscenity of understanding," I began. No, I never said this," Landsman barked at me. "Forget that quote." I was a bit taken aback by this, but fortunately I had brought with me the account of that evening with Claude Landsman, entitled The Obscenity of Understanding, from American Imago, the quarterly of the Association for Applied Psychoanalysis. I read to Landsman a passage from his spoken remarks that night. "You said, there are some pictures of Hitler as a baby, too, aren't there? I think that there is even a book written by a psychoanalyst about Hitler's childhood. Alice Miller's book, he later told me. An attempt at explanation which is, for me, obscenity as such." "Where did I say this?" Landsman demanded. I showed him the photocopied pages. "This is called An Evening with Claude Landsman. It's entitled The Obscenity of Understanding." "Show me this," he ordered me. "Where did it appear?" "In this publication, American Imago," I said, handing him the photocopied sheets. At this point, 2 minutes after it had begun, Landsman tried to end the interview. "Explain to me," he said, using the forbidden word, "what are you doing exactly?" I repeated to him what I'd written in my original letter to him that had resulted in the invitation to meet with him in Paris, that I was writing a book that would focus in part on the debate over the explicability of Hitler, a debate I first became interested in through my conversations in Jerusalem with Yehuda Bauer and Emil Fackenheim. I thought it was an interesting debate about whether explanation is possible or explanation is perhaps wrong. That's why I was interested in your remarks. "You don't speak French," he said, interrupting me. "No." "You should. You should learn. I have written about this." After agreeing with him that indeed I should, I explained that my book involved conversations with people in the controversy about questions they might not have addressed in written works. At this point, he again tried to end the interview, claiming that he did not have time, because of my mistake about the codes, of course, to address this long and difficult matter. But finally he relented and began to respond to my original question about his characterization of the very attempt to explain Hitler as obscene. He began by saying something surprising and paradoxical, something I hadn't seen, read, or heard him say before on the question. "I don't say that the Holocaust is an enigma," he told me. "I don't say this. I do not think so. It is an historical event which took place. It is not an event which took place out of history. In a way, it is a product of the whole story of the Western world since the very beginning." Before going further, it's important to note that Landsman has made two important and perhaps contradictory points. First, he'd conceded that he has called the question why an obscenity. And second, he had nonetheless offered a kind of answer to the forbidden question, offered an implicit explanation. Hitler and the Holocaust are a product of the whole story of the Western world, which has engendered the 6 million murders. Implicit therein is the assumption that there is something built into the very mode of thought and feeling, into the institutions, language, the deep structure of Western civilization that inevitably produced the Holocaust, an event described specifically as a product. Implicit as well is the assumption that Hitler himself is not an agent so much as a product. The formal cause of the mass murder is not the mind or will of Adolf Hitler, but the mentality of Western culture. except that Landsman is somewhat inconsistent, once having declared that it's not an enigma, that it can be explained as a product of history. He then turns around and reiterates to me his belief that the why of explanation is obscene. You can take all the reasons, all the fields of explanation, whether it is psychoanalytic explanation, an opposition between the German spirit, the German Geist, and the Jewish one, Hitler's childhood, and so on. You can take the unemployment in Germany, the economic crisis, whatever you want. You can take all of these fields of explanation, and every field can be true, and all the fields together can be true. But these are conditions. Even if they are necessary, they are not sufficient. A beautiful morning, you have to start to kill massively. And I said that there is a gap between all the fields of explanation and the actual killing. You cannot give birth, in French we say engendre, you cannot generate such an evil. And if you start to explain and to answer the question of why, you are led, whether you want it or not, to justification. The question as such shows its own obscenity. Why are the Jews being killed? Because there is no answer to the question of why. Because, in other words, any answer begins inevitably to legitimize, to make understandable that process. Landsman leaps from the epistemological inadequacy of explanation to condemning the moral inadequacy of those who try to explain, assuming accusatorily that they're acting in bad faith, that in attempting to explain, they intend to excuse. One of Landsman's critics in France, an expatriate American psychoanalyst named Sean Wilder, who had observed the havoc Landsman and his acolytes have wrought over this issue, their assault on a respected Parisian psychoanalytic institute that had the temerity to invite Binion to speak, resulted in the implosion and dissolution of the institute over the question, offered a common-sense critique of Landsman's position. I think the question of why is a fundamental human function. For Christ's sake, what do they think people are going to do? You put food in somebody's mouth, and if he chews and swallows it, he is going to digest it. The question why is the mental or intellectual equivalent to the process of digesting. You get information, and unless you are a bloody idiot, you work on it, and one of the fundamental intellectual processes is this question why. I think it is one of the nobler acquisitions of the human mind, and should be considered as such. Landsman's position in insisting that people ingest only raw information without digesting it is, to continue the metaphor, a kind of intellectual bulimia, although he prefers a different sense metaphor for his method, willed blindness. When I was making Shoah, I was like a horse with blinders, he told me. I did not look to the side, neither my right side nor my left side. I was trying to look straight into this black sun, which is the Holocaust. And this blindness, this voluntary blindness, is a necessary requisite, the necessary condition for the creation. And this blindness was the contrary of blindness. It was like clairvoyance. It was to see absolutely clearly, you know. And the only way to cope with this blinding reality is to blind oneself to all kinds of explanation, to refuse the explanation. It is the only way. It was a moral attitude, an ethical touchstone. Hearing Landsman rhapsodize in the eternal language of mystics and French intellectuals on blindness as insight and the ethical superiority of his position recalled to me another mystical formulation I'd seen him use. Didn't you once say that there should be a sacred flame around the Holocaust? I asked him. A circle of flame. Yes, one should never try to cross this circle. This seemed to me the very kind of language Huda Bauer was objecting to when he wrote his essay deploring the mystification of the Holocaust. If there's a circle of flame around it, how does one know what's inside the circle? Having spent considerable time with homicide detectives, I tried to imagine the reaction of those I've known if someone had said to them, Don't cross the circle around the body. Don't ask questions about the mind of the murderer. And yet the Holocaust, while vastly different in scale, is still a homicide. Exempting the mind of the murderers from scrutiny, shielding the murderers with a circle of flame, is a policy that could please only the murderers and their would-be successors. A circle of flame around Hitler's psychology too? I asked Landsman. Don't try to cross. No, there is no circle of flame around Hitler. I don't look at psychology. I am not interested in it. No circle of flame, but still a willed circumscription of inquiry. The SS men in your movie? Not interested in their psychology either? I was not interested in the psychology. I always said to them, I don't talk about you, I am not interested in you. I wanted to ask them how it happened. By how, he means only how, mechanically, they accomplished it, not how they could have become inhuman enough to want to do it. Yehuda Bauer says that there is a danger of mystification if we set off the Holocaust and Hitler from the processes of history and psychology. There's a sacralization, mystification of the Holocaust. If we say that it can't be explained, that it's a mystery beyond understanding. But I told you at the beginning that it is not a mystery beyond understanding, he said. But if we can't get from the people who did it to the actual event, if there's a gap, as you've said, an abyss between the cause and effect, how did it happen? How did it happen? Yes. I have shown it, I think. You've shown that it did happen, but how did ordinary men come to this? Were they evil? Were they possessed by demonism? No, I never said this. No, you don't understand me, that's all. I believe the problem is not that I don't understand Landsman, but that I do. That his position is philosophically inconsistent. Above all else, he insists it is wrong to try to explain the murders, because inevitably that will excuse them, absolve them of responsibility. And yet he insists that there is no enigma about why the Holocaust happened. He has the explanation. It is the product of the whole story of Western civilization, which in effect does absolve individuals from responsibility. It is not the individual, conscious, thus culpable decisions of the murderers that are responsible for the Holocaust. It is rather the machine, the engine of all of Western history that produces the crime. If one is forbidden from inquiring into the psychology of the decision to murder, there is no way to account for it happening aside from spontaneous generation or some vague notion of everything causing everything, an abstract historical inevitability that excuses the murderers from individual responsibility. I don't believe Landsman wants to absolve or exculpate the murderers of responsibility. All the more reason for him to be cautious in ascribing exculpatory revisionist motives to those who take different philosophical positions on explanation from his. Even Landsman's professed devotion to the question how, as opposed to why, is called into question by his attack on a recent book that demolishes the no-gas chamber arguments of the Holocaust deniers. The book, written by a former revisionist, Jean-Claude Brissac, is based upon documents Brissac found in the Soviet archives, documents described in a New York Times story on Brissac as previously unpublished commercial correspondence and contracts linking Nazi officers at Auschwitz and the German Engineering Corporation that built the gas chambers, ventilation systems, elevators, crematories, and other devices that made murder possible. The French Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld, the man who brought Klaus Barbie to justice, called the Brissac book a major contribution to the literature of the Holocaust. A problem existed, Klarsfeld told the Times. Exactly how did the gas chambers and the crematoria work? How could that number of bodies be disposed of? It was a question of explaining and documenting a criminal technique, and Brissac has now provided the most authoritative account. One would have thought that Landsmann, who eternally urges that we should blind ourselves to everything but the how, the criminal technique, would have welcomed the production of these revealing documents, which revealed precisely how. Yes, the documents were discovered by a former revisionist, but that does not make them less authentic. And in his film, Landsmann did not scruple to ask former SS men how. But according to the Times, Landsmann was enraged by the book. Mr. Pressac's work, he wrote in the weekly Le Nouvel Observateur, is pernicious and marked by the bizarre reasoning of people who deny the Holocaust. By insisting on documentary proof, by discounting the emotional testimony of survivors, the book legitimizes the arguments of revisionists, who become the point of reference for future debate. I prefer the tears of the barber from Treblinka in Shoah to a Pressac documentary on gas detectors. He prefers, then, his own staged and crafted catharsis to documentary facts. But what about the importance of combating neo-Nazis' lies, which are used to justify contemporary violence against the Jews? Hitler rose to power on the back of revisionist history, the stab-in-the-back myth that Germany didn't lose the war, but was cheated out of a victory by a conspiracy of Jews and Jewish-controlled November criminals. If Pressac helps pull the rug out from under contemporary liars and deniers, shouldn't one try to combat neo-Nazi revisionists in every way? I asked Landsmann. First of all, he says, I didn't say this. The Times was misquoting you? Yes, he said. It is a journalistic thing. The Times reporter told me he stood by his story when I read it back to him. Okay, so tell me what you do feel about the Pressac book. What is the Pressac book? Pressac is a former revisionist. He's convinced that the gas chambers did actually exist, and he's not discovering anything new in this. Absolutely nothing. He opens the door of the gas chamber. Everybody knew they were there. Everyone knew, but a powerful and insidious claque of deniers is having disturbing success in convincing an alarming number of people they might not have been there. Klarsfeld, who has been on the front line of the fight against real Nazis and neo-Nazis, rather than the battle over the aesthetics of filming them that Landsmann is engaged in, believes the Pressac book is a useful weapon against the deniers. Landsmann purports to be interested in describing how the crime was committed, but sees no particular value in studying how to prevent it from being committed again. Yehuda Bauer told me, I mentioned to Landsmann, that if we don't try to understand how it happened, then we learn nothing about preventing it from happening again. Landsmann refused to believe Bauer could have said this. I have known Yehuda Bauer for a long time, and I am astonished he talks like this. In fact, in an essay entitled On the Place of the Holocaust in History, Attacking Mystifiers, Yehuda Bauer argued that once a catastrophe like the Holocaust has happened, it can be repeated. The Holocaust can be a precedent, or it can become a warning. A warning, that is, against the possibility of repetition that Landsmann is so unconcerned with. Don't you believe, I asked him, that it's worth investigating the process of history in order to— Okay, he said disgustedly. We do this. I did it. As I told you, the Holocaust is not something which is out of history, so it is an historical event. But you seem to be saying it's out of psychology. I tell you, you can take psychology, you can take economic conditions, you can take whatever you want. All of this might be true, but this doesn't give birth to the Holocaust. You cannot engender the Holocaust. As I told you, it's an ethical position. Landsmann is quick to define whatever choice he'd made as the only ethical one, but his self-proclaimed ethical position leads him to strange kinds of passivity in the face of the neo-Nazi movement in contemporary Europe. What about the neo-Nazis of Germany today? I asked him. One should not write about them. They want to kill Jews again. It is not complicated, Landsman says, to understand them. And I don't think that history repeats itself. You can write about the neo-Nazis if you can convince them, and so on, yes, he allows. But can one do that without investigating the Nazis of the past? Listen, what kind of investigation do you need? It has been done, he repeats. I did it. I already did it. It's been done. I have done it. After Shoah, it is forbidden to speak of certain things, because I have already said what needs to be said. The rest should be silence. If Landsman's disciple can accuse Rudolf Binion of using method as final solution, one can almost say Landsman wants Shoah to be the final solution of Hitler explanation. Further discussion must be terminated, if not exterminated. Toward the close of our encounter, I asked him directly, "Is it all to be condemned, to write or even think about Hitler?" "I think it is to be condemned," he said. "I think it is, all the way." At this point, Landsman went to get some homework for me. He handed me a copy of a collection of essays on Shoah, and instructed me to read the one he'd written, the one called Hier ist kein Warum, Here There Is No Why, the locus classicus of his attack on explanation. I was familiar with that essay already. I was familiar with the story Landsman tells in that essay, the story about an incident in Auschwitz which Landsman makes the very heart and soul of his commandment against explanation, the why of his attack on why. And I still find myself amazed by his use of it. It's a story he takes from Primo Levi's memoir, Survival in Auschwitz. Here is Levi's story. It's about his first disorienting day in the camp. The whole process of introduction to what was for us a new order took place in a grotesque and sarcastic manner. When the tattooing operation was finished, they shut us in a vacant hut. The bunks are made, but we are severely forbidden to touch or sit on them, so we wander around aimlessly, still tormented by the parching thirsts of the journey. Driven by thirst, I eyed a fine icicle outside the window, within hand's reach. I opened the window and broke off the icicle, but at once a large, heavy guard prowling outside brutally snatched it away from me. "Warum?" I asked him in my poor German. "Hier ist kein Warum. There is no why here," he replied, pushing me inside with a shove. And here is what Landsman makes of this story in his essay. It is enough to formulate the question in simplistic terms, why have the Jews been killed, for the question to reveal right away its obscenity. There is an absolute obscenity in the very project of understanding. Not to understand was my iron law during all 11 years of the production of Shoah. I had clung to this refusal of understanding as the only possible ethical attitude. Hier ist kein Warum. Primo Levi narrates how the word Auschwitz was taught to him by an SS guard. Here there is no why, Primo Levi was abruptly told upon his arrival at the camp. This law is equally valid for whoever undertakes the responsibility of such a transmission, because the act of transmitting what happened in the Holocaust is the only thing that matters, and no intelligibility, that is to say, no true knowledge pre-exists the process of transmission. Emphasis added. A truly astonishing thing has happened here. Set aside the fact that he comes close to asserting the position that the Shoah did not exist until its transmission by Landsman in Shoah. Even more bizarrely, Landsman has taken an SS death camp guard's grotesque and sarcastic rebuke to a Jew asking why, and made that sneering mass murderer's command into his own commandment. He's made an insulting description, here there is no why, of a policy designed to keep the gas chambers running on time, without any troublesome Jewish questions harrying the murderers, into a moral injunction. Here there should be no why. The SS guard tells the thirsty Jew he must suffer his torments without asking why. Claude Lanzmann tells those thirsty for knowledge, for an explanation, that they must suffer in a silence imposed by him. Perhaps it might be different if Lanzmann had been content to impose what he proudly calls his iron law on himself and his own work as a kind of discipline. But in fact, he and his acolytes have become a kind of gang of intellectual enforcers who don't merely disagree, but seek to suppress those who break Lanzmann's law. Thou shalt have no Holocaust discussion that violates my iron law. It's important to distinguish skeptical, even scathing critiques of Hitler explanations. In part, this book is about the follies and fiascos of certain explanatory attempts, from Lanzmann's position. This ill-considered adaptation of the death camp guard's abusive remark to a thirsty Jewish prisoner, as a motto with which to silence all inquiry, suggests Lanzmann has lost his sense of proportion, that staring too long into this black sun has blinded him to the identity of the real enemy. Or so it would seem from his treatment of Dr. Louis Michaels. Chapter 15. Dr. Louis Michaels, There Must Be a Why, in which an Auschwitz survivor fights for the right to ask why. It all began, this memorable psychodrama, with a polite invitation Dr. Michaels sent to Claude Lanzmann. A soft-spoken gentleman, this survivor of a brutal hell is in every respect the soul of politeness. I began to get a sense of his extraordinary thoughtfulness in the very process of making arrangements to visit him, to talk about his confrontation with Lanzmann. Dr. Michaels told me he'd pick me up at the Westport station, and then went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that we would not miss each other when the train from New York pulled in. I'd told him that since I have red hair, I'd be easy to recognize in a crowd, but he proceeded to describe his car in great detail, and even made me write down his license plate number. It was, for one thing, an interesting contrast with Claude Lanzmann's behavior in arranging our rendezvous, neglecting to give me the access code for his building, and then insisting that he had, practically accusing me of lying in denying he had. But I also suspect there was more than mere politeness involved in Dr. Michaels going so far as to insist I write down his license plate number. It was, I believe, a touching reflection of the lifelong sense of the fragility of human contact a Holocaust survivor must have. That sense of fragility haunts Dr. Michaels's profoundly moving and sad memoir of his experience, Dr. Number 117641, a Holocaust memoir. In 1942, Michaels, a young Dutch medical student, and his fiancée Nora, he doesn't use her real name in his memoir, fled a Nazi roundup in Antwerp, only to be arrested on the run and sent to the first of several concentration camps. He and Nora were separated for a time, but finally in mid-1943 found themselves, and found each other again, at Auschwitz. Michaels's account of their time at Auschwitz is one of horror, yes, but also a story of how their relationship, their fleeting contacts, their notes from cell block to cell block, their love, kept their sanity and their humanity alive amid conditions of inhuman savagery. It's a story about the survival of humanity in hell, but it's also an account of the degrees of evil in hell, particularly as manifested by the camp personnel Michaels came to know best, the doctors of Auschwitz, the medical men who partook in healing and killing at the same time. Men like Dr. Eduard Wirtz, who personally sent tens of thousands to instant death by participating in the infamous selections at the railroad platform at Auschwitz, choosing which arriving Jews would be sent to be gassed immediately, and which were fit enough to be saved for a brief living death as slave laborers. And Dr. Hans Munk, another doctor who played a more ambiguous role there, Michaels believes, refusing to participate in selections and, according to Michaels, demonstrating life-saving decency to many of the prisoners under his medical care. It was the appearance of Michaels's fiancée 40 years later in a documentary film about Dr. Wirtz that was the seed of the showdown between Michaels and Claude Lanzmann. He and Nora had been separated shortly after the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945, Michaels told me one autumn afternoon on the deck of his Westport home. When they found each other finally, it was not a storybook ending. Our feeling of love could not be salvaged, Michaels wrote in a deeply saddening passage in his memoir. He went to America, where he became a psychoanalyst, a professor of psychiatry on the faculty of the Yale School of Medicine, and president of the Western New England Institute for Psychoanalysis. Nora remained in their native Holland, and although Dr. Michaels married, they stayed in touch, and in the late 80s she wrote to tell him that she had appeared as a witness in a documentary two Dutch Jewish filmmakers had made about Dr. Wirtz. Michaels sent for a tape of the film, which was shown on Dutch television but never released commercially, and found it flawed but thought-provoking. In addition to Nora, among the witnesses was Dr. Munk, the one who'd refused to take part in the selections, and who was the only Nazi doctor acquitted in a war crimes trial, in part because of the testimony of Auschwitz survivors who believed they owed their lives to him. I thought Munk was important, Michaels told me, because he demonstrated that it was possible to refuse to participate in some aspects of the killing process without being punished for it. A fact that contradicts the exculpatory claims of many Nazis who said if they hadn't participated in the killing, they would have been killed. On the other hand, Michaels recognizes clearly that Munk did not resign from or resist the whole killing system. His behavior raises the question of whether there can be degrees of evil in hell. By staying where he was and saving some Jewish lives, was Munk doing good in the midst of evil? By refusing to participate in selections but following other SS orders, can it be said Munk was better than Wirtz? Or are such distinctions meaningless in Auschwitz? These are the questions Robert Lifton addresses in his study The Nazi Doctors with his theory of doubling, the doubling of the Nazi doctors' personalities into killer and healer components, with little communication between the two. The questions are valid, Michaels believed. So he wrote politely to Claude Lanzmann, inviting him to discuss these questions, never expecting the traumatic consequences of his request. Lanzmann was scheduled to be at Yale for a series of seminars with the French and history departments in April 1990. Michaels invited him to participate in a panel discussion with him at a meeting of the Western New England Psychoanalytic Association, scheduled for the same week at Yale. Michaels proposed they discuss Shoah, Michaels's memoir, and the film about Wirtz, which Michaels described in summary to Lanzmann. Lanzmann accepted the invitation without commenting on the Wirtz film, and Michaels heard nothing further from him until he arrived in New Haven 2 days before the panel discussion. Michaels first met Lanzmann that evening over dinner at the home of Dr. Dori Laub, a survivor and co-founder of the Yale Holocaust Witness Project. He behaved very strangely, Michaels said of Lanzmann, both that night and throughout. At the dinner I attended, Dr. Michaels's wife told me, he made so much trouble over food. First it had to be a vegetarian meal, then he refused to eat the vegetarian food, then the wine was no good. I watched him take a swallow and spit it back into his glass. I think he was going to say something about how bad it was until he caught me looking at him with horror. What Lanzmann did at the first dinner was essentially spit out the film Dr. Michaels wanted to show and discuss. Michaels ran a tape of it for him. He saw the movie, but when I asked him for comments, he walked out of the room. I followed him and pressed him, but all he would say was, If you show that movie, I won't come." Michaels was under some pressure. The panel discussion was heavily oversubscribed because of Landsman, whose renown far exceeded Michaels's. If Landsman withdrew, many would be disappointed. So Michaels told Landsman, "I won't show the movie. Let's talk about Shoah. I'll talk about some of my experiences." He apologized for his behavior about the film, and I expected him not to talk about it. But when his turn came, he began to talk about it. He began to attack it. "Did you experience it as a personal attack?" I asked Michaels. "Yes," he told me. Dr. Michaels is not one to overdramatize. Life has shown him far too much real drama for that. He is as mild-mannered a man as he is polite, so when he says that Landsman's attack on the film and him reminded him of the totalitarian methods of the camp guards, it is not something he says casually. I've read the transcript of the public clash that evening over the film, and Landsman's attack on the film in front of an audience of Michaels's colleagues and friends cannot be seen as anything but a personal attack. Landsman conceded that he was violent, very violent, in his denunciation of the film, and his public attack on the film that night was so full of fury and venom, it was difficult to interpret as anything but an attack on its sponsor, on anyone who believed the film should be shown and discussed, and not simply burned and destroyed. The panel discussion that evening, before an audience of psychoanalysts, Yale academics, and guests, began with Dr. Michaels speaking about his experience in Auschwitz, speaking in particular about the Auschwitz phenomenon in which prisoners became Geheimnisträgers, bearers of secrets, secrets about what was really happening, secrets about what had become of the people who disappeared from within their midst, about the work many of them did keeping the machinery of death running. The silence was necessary in part because the secrets were literally unspeakable, in part because the penalty for talking about them was death, and finally because survival was possible only by a willed refusal to accept the truth. Geheimnisträgers. At his home 50 years and half a world away from Auschwitz, I asked Dr. Michaels if the real secret too unbearable to utter was the truth about human nature. "Yes," he said, "about how bad it could be. No one had known how bad." But now, today, Dr. Michaels told the audience at Yale that evening, it is important for those who are the secret bearers to tell their secrets, to make a breach in the wall of silence around the Holocaust. He was followed by Claude Landsman, who felt it was more important to silence Dr. Michaels. After an effusive introduction, "Shoah is more than the film event of the century, but a truly revolutionary artistic and cultural event in its own right," Landsman took the stage and, to Dr. Michaels's surprise, announced he would explain why he forbade the expected showing of the Wirtz film and the discussion about it Dr. Michaels wanted to have. In terms of contempt, using the jargon of Lacanian film theorists, Landsman told the audience, "It's a very bad film, in my opinion. One doesn't even know who did it. I think 2 people from Holland. But it's a film without any kind of signature. There is no desire behind this film." Emphasis added. Having dismissed it first of all for the sin of not fulfilling Lacanian film buff criteria, Landsman goes on to make an even uglier charge. "I had to tell myself that the purpose of the film was the rehabilitation of this Nazi doctor. It is a bad film that complacently sets out to explore a Nazi soul." Emphasis added. At this point, Dr. Michaels, an Auschwitz survivor, stood accused, in effect, of being so morally obtuse that he would complacently sponsor a film that rehabilitated Nazis. One step away from the ultimate Landsman accusation, revisionist. Although Landsman claimed to respect very much Dr. Michaels, he told his colleagues that the film Michaels wanted to show represented for me all of the things I have always fought against with all my strength, what I have called the obscenity of the very project of understanding. All this after Landsman had refused to tell Michaels to his face why he objected to the film when Michaels pressed him at their introductory dinner. All this after Landsman had indicated that he would not launch an attack on the film at the panel discussion. "Did you feel betrayed?" I asked Michaels. "Yes, I did," he told me. "He led me to believe he would not." "Did you feel betrayed?" I asked Michaels. "Yes, I did," he told me. "He led me to believe he would not." Not only was Dr. Michaels caught off guard, he was outmatched physically. At 73, fragile and slender, Dr. Michaels said the 6-foot-plus Landsman, an imposing figure in his black leather jacket, reminded him of a German general, both in his physical stature and his aggressive, pounding assault on Michaels's position and judgment. Indeed, Landsman was only getting started in an epic savaging of the film he wouldn't let the audience see. As he expanded on his accusation of the obscenity of, and thus the need to censor, the film he forbade, he focused first on its transgression of his commandment against studying Nazi baby pictures. "I wish to give you the reasons for my revolt against the forbidden film," Landsman says, adopting the pose of the heroic resistance fighter rather than his actual role, a man who used his celebrity power to force the panel into dropping it under threat of refusing to appear. "The film that I forbade started with a picture of this Nazi doctor as a child, as a baby. He's a smiling child." Here he invokes his dictum that you cannot engender the Holocaust by explaining how smiling babies become mass murderers. Not only can you not engender it, you cannot discuss the question of how it happens. But they do, somehow. The babies in the baby pictures who do not seem to manifest a desire to murder do grow up to be baby killers. Some babies do, some babies do not. The ones who do must acquire the ability, the desire to do so, somehow. It doesn't happen by spontaneous generation. The fact that they do seems to be of some legitimate interest to those who live among babies and baby killers. But such interest is forbidden by Landsman. Any such inquiry must, he insists, entail sympathy for the devil, for mass murderers. All explanation is excuse. But, Landsman thundered on, the mindset of such a film with its baby pictures is not only obscenity, it is real cowardice. It is a way of escaping. It is a way not to face the horror. It seemed more than a bit odd for Landsman, who has faced the horror of Auschwitz only on film, to lecture Dr. Michaels, who has faced it in person, about cowardice. But still, Landsman is not finished. To Dr. Michaels's horror, he's devoting his entire speech that night to denouncing the film Michaels wanted to discuss. And now, on top of obscenity and cowardice, he tosses out his favored trump card insult, revisionism. He cites a discussion between Elie Wiesel and the Archbishop of Paris, who was born a Jew but raised a Catholic by the French family that sheltered him during the war. In the context of a discussion with Wiesel on a French television show, the Archbishop said, according to Landsman, "The true problem, the true question of the Holocaust, is the problem of evil." An assertion Landsman insists is such a cowardly evasion of the horror that happened at Auschwitz that it amounts to revisionism. Landsman accuses the Archbishop not just of being a revisionist, but of being a revisionist in a much more perverse form than that of a Holocaust denier. Always, Landsman insists on assuming bad faith, as the existentialists like to call it, on the part of those who discuss the subject in any fashion that violates his commandments. The Jewish Archbishop, he says, making a point of playing up his Jewishness, cannot be attempting, sincerely if misguidedly, to discuss the question. He must be a cowardly revisionist. Having announced the discovery of a much more perverse form of revisionism, he finds evidence of it in the film Dr. Michaels wanted to simply discuss. The chief evidence, aside from the baby pictures, the film presents a discussion of the meaning of Dr. Wirtz's suicide shortly after he was captured. Wirtz's family members speculate about whether he killed himself in part out of consciousness of guilt. The presence of this footage in the film, the implication Wirtz might be suffering pangs of conscience, when in fact the filmmakers might be taking just as jaundiced a view of the relative's rationalization as Landsman does, makes it too dangerous to be shown, Landsman insists. Landsman makes explicit his paternalist censor role toward the close of his assault. He realizes, he says, that the intensity of his attack might give the audience a strong desire to see this film. But, he jokes condescendingly, he's now prepared that you see the film because I have given directions for use, and this was necessary because there are some virgin brains among you. The response of the audience to this tirade, when it finally concluded, was mixed. I felt worst for Dr. Michaels, most conscious of the sense of isolation and betrayal he must have felt, when I read in the transcript the way Michaels's colleague and fellow panelist Dory Laub suddenly and unexpectedly attacked the film. Laub was, after all, the co-sponsor of the evening. He'd seen the film, but never raised any objections to it, certainly not to Dr. Michaels, until that very moment. But Landsman had been violent, very violent, in his attack on the film to Laub before the panel convened, as well as in his attack on the film at the panel. And rather than defend Dr. Michaels or plan to show the film, Laub felt compelled in his closing remarks to publicly take Landsman's side. His rationale was curious. He announced that he'd been fooled, hoaxed. He said that when Dr. Michaels first showed him the film, he'd understood the German-speaking witnesses, but not the Dutch. When he saw it again with Landsman, with subtitles for the Dutch, he had a revelation, a radical change of mind. I realized that the film was a hoax. He doesn't explain very clearly why what the Dutch speakers had to say caused his hoax conviction. Here is how he tried to explain it. There was no balance whatsoever between this feeble and fumbling attempt of German self-explanation and that of the Dutch survivors. The Germans' attempts were hardly substantive. They were not enough. There was a disproportion. And I thought it was right not to be exposed to this kind of information. As if it would be a better, less dangerous film to watch if the German self-justifications were more convincing. And what of Dr. Michaels? After indirectly, implicitly being charged with the intention to promulgate a cowardly revisionist work, he now seemed to stand accused of having perpetrated a hoax on his colleague Dory Laub, concealing from him the supposedly revelatory words of the Dutch witnesses. I can understand the dismay Dr. Michaels must have felt at this moment, but fortunately Michaels did find at least one passionate defender that night. Late in the evening, one member of the audience rose and spoke out eloquently to Landsman. What I have to say is very painful. It has to do with the difficulty of learning from history and history repeating itself in different guises. The Nazis started with a kind of book burning, by saying that there are things that people should not see because they are bad for people, because they are too upsetting to the ideas that they have, because they misrepresent, because people cannot be allowed to make their own minds up about it. The Wirtz film may be a terrible film, but I'm very disappointed and very angry that I was not given the opportunity to make my own mind up about it, and that you used as justification for that an ideological stance which is a repetition of exactly what it is that you're attempting to help us to understand. and I find that very upsetting." Emphasis added. This was followed by loud assent from the audience. Then a second person in the audience was emboldened to challenge Landsman, and referring to the last speaker, told Landsman, "He feels that people should have been able to make up their own mind." A true revolt seemed to be brewing. "You can watch the film if you want," Landsman replies. "He'll just go into the corridor and smoke a cigarette. It's absolutely boring," he says dismissively. "I don't know what this film wants to convey." Another audience member challenges him now. "Why should you have to know what it's going to convey before we can see it?" Here Landsman adopts an ironic, paternalistic tone. "I really wanted to protect you from it." Finally, an audience member says, "I would be very interested if Dr. McHale's— he's a soft-spoken man, but it's a film that personally, Dr. McHale's, you're involved in. Could you make some comments on it?" 4 years later, Dr. McHale's and I are seated in his dining room overlooking Long Island Sound. He's just shown me the forbidden Wirtz film, and he's telling me what he really wanted to say that night to Landsman, and why he didn't. He was, he says, taken aback by Landsman's assault. But there was something more. Landsman looked and acted so apoplectic, Dr. McHale's felt he might have been about to break down or fall apart. And so, at the time, McHale's told me, he was reluctant to provoke further outbursts. He looked out of control. He confined himself that night to a dignified response. "One objection you, Claude, had to the movie was that it was an attempt to rehabilitate Wirtz. I didn't see that in the movie. Almost all of the participants were indicting Wirtz." I didn't see rehabilitation in the film when I watched either. I was alert for the kind of exculpatory psychologizing Landsman had indicted it for. Yes, there are the dangerous baby pictures whose insidious subtext Landsman warned against. And yes, Wirtz's surviving family members ramble on confusedly about whether Wirtz's suicide after capture indicated a consciousness of guilt rather than mere knowledge or certainty of imminent trial and execution. But if the family members want to rehabilitate Wirtz, the film does not endorse their project. The film provides copious, sickening examples of Wirtz's criminality from those survivors who witnessed it, including Dr. McHale's dignified but impassioned former fiancée, Nora. In any case, it scarcely seemed the sinister, quasi-revisionist document Landsman portrayed it as, even with the subtitles for the Dutch. But of course, the content of the film was not really the issue at all. Landsman is a man possessed by a rage against explanation. It is a rage I find much sympathy for when examining critically the often ludicrous failures of attempts to explain Hitler and the Holocaust. But it seems to me that for Landsman it has become a blind rage. Blindness has been elevated from a filmmaking tactic to a cosmic principle. It's an abstract rage about the crime of the Holocaust that blinded him to the feelings of one of its flesh and blood victims, a rage that made the victim, rather than the perpetrators, the object of his wrath that night. It has blinded him to the possibility that not all who seek answers or attempt to understand are knowing perpetrators of an obscenity. I'd been surprised at the unquestioning obeisance Landsman's dictum on this question had received from his academic acolytes, and for a while felt alone in being disturbed by it, until I found I had an ally in Tzvetan Todorov, the respected writer, critic, and director of research at the Centre National de Recherche in Paris. In his 1996 work about the death camp experience, Facing the Extreme, which appeared about a year or so after my encounter with Landsman, Todorov remarks that Primo Levi spent 40 years after Auschwitz trying to understand why, so that he might fight the rule that harsh epigram, "Here there is no why," conveyed, whereas Landsmann prefers to make the moral lesson of the SS man his own. But it was Dr. Michaels, that afternoon in Connecticut, who provided me with the most persuasive and eloquent defense of the question why. It was something he came up with after the showdown with Landsmann had passed, the reply he would have made if he hadn't been stunned by the tone of Landsmann's assault. It's a reply to Landsmann's appropriation of the line from the SS guard in Primo Levi's story, "Hier est kein Warum." A misuse of the line, Dr. Michaels insists. He reads me something he's written on the subject. "The word here is the important one for my argument," Michaels told me. "It refers to the world of Auschwitz, which has become synonymous with the Holocaust. I have, as others, described this world from my personal experience as so different and so foreign, another planet, light years away. It was inhabited by creatures that had little, if anything, in common with what we consider human beings. In that world, I agree, ist kein Warum. However, in the civilized world, to which so few of us, including Primo Levi, returned, there should be das soll ein Warum sein. Without an attempt, no matter how difficult and complex, at understanding, that very world, where truth is most important, could be lost again. Das soll ein Warum sein. There must be a why." Part 7. Blame and Origins. The Search for the Source of the Final Solution. Chapter 16. Emil Fackenheim and Yehuda Bauer. The Temptation to Blame God. In which contemplation of Hitler as an actor prompts the leading theologian of the Holocaust to make a double move. I came to Jerusalem to speak about theology with a historian and about history with a theologian. In the time I spent talking with Yehuda Bauer and Emil Fackenheim, respectively the foremost historian of the Holocaust and the preeminent theologian of the Holocaust, I'm not sure which struck me more forcefully, their agreements or their disagreements. Their disagreements were certainly more dramatic. There was their clash over Hitler's normality. For Bauer, Hitler's murderousness was not ordinary, but unfortunately not abnormal, not in human history, not in Nazi Germany. While for Fackenheim, Hitler was beyond any previous notion of normal humanness. For Fackenheim, there is a radical disjuncture between human nature and Hitler nature, a radical disjuncture between ordinary evil and radical evil. Then there was their even deeper disagreement over the theoretical possibility of explaining Hitler. To Bauer, Hitler was, in principle at least, perfectly explicable, as all men are. To Fackenheim, even the best explanations of Hitler are doomed to failure. Only God can account for such radical evil, and he's not talking. Wide as the gulf is between them on these issues, more remarkable to me are those matters on which, coming from such differing perspectives, they agree. Both historian and theologian agree that Hitler is still a mystery, that Hitler has not been explained in practice as opposed to theory. That something is explicable in principle, Bauer told me, does not mean it has been explained already. And it hasn't been, Hitler hasn't been, this most thoughtful and searching student of Holocaust history insists. The evidence on Hitler's evolution is too thin to support a confident conjecture about the source of his evil. I'd like to find it, yes, Bauer told me, but I haven't. I just don't know. Another surprising point of agreement, the use of the word evil. They agree on the applicability to Hitler of a term that so many are reluctant to use. This might not be surprising coming from a theologian such as Fackenheim, although he has wrestled at great length to try to redefine the nature of evil in the light of the radical evil he believes Hitler's regime brought into being. But it is somewhat surprising for a historian such as Bauer, a professed atheist, not at all given to unnecessary metaphysical speculation. But Bauer had no hesitation in employing the term contemporary sophisticates are reluctant to employ. "Hitler is not insane," Bauer told me. "He is evil, what I would call near ultimate evil." To reach Yehuda Bauer's office on the Mount Scopus campus of Hebrew University, I found myself crossing Nancy Reagan Plaza, passing by the Frank Sinatra Student Center, before winding down some steps to the more modest edifice that housed the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. The disjuncture between the styling moose aura of the Sassoon brand name and the seriousness of the center's mission, although Sassoon did serve in the Israeli army, disappeared once I found myself in the fiercely focused, intimidating presence of Yehuda Bauer, whom I'd come to regard with some awe for the historical and moral authority of his work. In addition to being founder and chairman of the Department of Holocaust Studies at Hebrew University, Bauer must be considered one, if not the chief, founder of the entire discipline. His work is prodigious in its scope and profusion. At the time we spoke, he was also serving as editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal he founded, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, serving on the editorial board of the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Publishing Project, and all the while writing and publishing some dozen books of his own, including The Holocaust in Historical Perspective, The Jewish Emergence from Powerlessness, American Jewry and the Holocaust, and A History of the Holocaust. It was almost as if Bauer's remarkable output was in some way a personal response, an embodiment of the Jewish emergence from powerlessness in history, a way of regaining control over the history that in the past had made Jews powerless victims. But it was not so much the quantity of his work as its intelligence and penetration that impressed me. The direct, unsparing clarity, the surgical precision with which he opened up and examined the most difficult, highly charged questions raised by the behavior of the perpetrators and the experience of the victims, the courage he had to confront such issues without sentimentality, his impassioned commitment to the subject, combined with the scholarly dispassion with which he dissected ultimate questions of the relationship between the Holocaust and history, between the Holocaust and Hitler. I was drawn initially to Bauer's work by a couple of powerfully argued polemics in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, in which he attacked those he called mystifiers. In Is the Holocaust Explicable? He speaks of an increasing number of commentators, theologians, writers as well as historians, who argue that ultimately the Holocaust is a mystery, an inexplicable event in human history. Various expressions are used, such as tremendum with its theological connotations. They all indicate a measure of final incomprehension. They've given up too soon, he says, in effect. It does not diminish the gravity and terror of the Holocaust to say that in some ways it can be compared to other tragedies, and that in some ways it can't. But the fact that in some ways it can't, that in some ways it's unprecedented, doesn't remove it from the realm of human nature or human comprehension. It makes it a new disturbing fact of human nature, not necessarily a metaphysical mystery we must sacralize with the circle of flame around it, the barrier to thought Claude Lanzmann wants to erect. Although Bauer doesn't name Fackenheim specifically as one of the mystifiers, I had a sense he might have had in mind the man dubbed the preeminent theologian of the Holocaust, and I wanted to see what the most searching historian of the Holocaust had to say about some of the issues raised by the leading theologian of the Holocaust. A thin, intense, no-nonsense scholar in white shirt sleeves and black-framed glasses, Bauer grew up in post-Kafka Prague. He was born in 1926, until his family escaped to Haifa in 1939. And he might look at home as an actuary in Kafka's insurance office. His powerful and passionate commitment to historical truth is belied by a dry, dismissive, self-effacing style of discourse. Perhaps it's the bleak, bone-dry ironies of a desert kibbutznik. Bauer had made his home in Kibbutz Shoval in the Negev Desert since 1953. Bauer was, as usual, busy that day. He confined himself largely to short, compressed answers, ones that nonetheless frequently concealed slow-detonating shocks. It was difficult to draw him out at length on Hitler-centric questions, because he believes the evidence is too fragmentary for conclusive judgments. But he did register agreement with Milton Himmelfarb's no Hitler, no Holocaust stance, that the tragedy was not an inevitable consequence of unstoppable forces. Without the driving force of Hitler, Bauer told me, there probably would not have been a Holocaust. Hitler radicalized a nation that was otherwise anti-Semitic enough to be complicit with his final solution, but not enough so to have demanded or forced it themselves. Bauer made an important distinction about Hitler. Although Hitler was not ordinary, Bauer believes he was not abnormal, not inhuman. That's the problem we have with them, the Nazis, because they are like us and we are like them, in many ways. He did offer a provisional judgment about the origin of Hitler's anti-Semitism, one he believes is originally traceable to his Viennese environment that included extreme anti-Semitic ideologies, especially of the sort of half-occult groups like the Ostara group and others. And while, during his wartime service in the trenches, Hitler exhibited little hostility to Jews, after 1918, with the trauma of the defeat, with the destruction of his world, he goes back to the explanation he found in Vienna. To Bauer, the locus of the real mystery about Hitler and the Holocaust is the question of when Hitler made up his mind for extermination, when Hitler crossed what Bauer calls the moral Rubicon between imagining the final solution and ordering and implementing it. He finds the attempts to answer that question frustrated by what he believes was Hitler's deliberate obfuscation. He believes Hitler issued an oral order to proceed with a final solution in March 1941. But how long before that had Hitler envisioned extermination? Did it lurk beneath ostensible plans for mass expulsion that were the public face of Nazi Jewish policy until then? Hitler's a very careful individual, very circumspect, with regard to that, Bauer told me. He proceeds with that in a very crafty manner. Deliberately covering his tracks? I asked. Well, maybe there were no tracks. All the more reason, Bauer believes, not to dismiss him as insane, a psychopath. You can only assume he's evil if he's not insane. And Bauer has no doubt Hitler is evil. Hitler is what I would call near-ultimate evil. The notion of near-ultimate evil was a bridge to Bauer's surprising, even shocking remarks about God. For someone who doesn't believe in God's existence, he'd told me he was an atheist, Bauer has some strong opinions of his character if he did exist. I'd asked Bauer if he'd become an atheist because of the near-ultimate evil he saw unleashed, unchecked by God or man, during the Holocaust. Post factum, maybe, he said. But I had no room for any relevance of a God, even if he existed, before that. He grew up in a non-observant family, he said, his mother an atheist, his father nominally Reform. I was religious at the age of 17, he said, which would have been in 1943, and he's still very interested in religion, because I think it's a very important phenomenon historically, certainly among Jews, so you could call me a religion-loving atheist. One who, he says, looks at religion on the positive-negative scale in terms of what's good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. Certainly, religion was good for the Jews for a very long period of time. It doesn't work too well today, Where was God during the Holocaust? The record of God, as far as the Jewish people is concerned, is not too overwhelming of late. But you can talk in terms of Hitler's evil, whether you are religious or not, actually. What about certain Orthodox seers here in Israel who've said the Holocaust was part of God's plan, who even describe Hitler as the rod of God's anger at the Jews of Europe who were falling away from strict Torah worship, or the Holocaust as a way for God to set up the establishment of the State of Israel? Well, that's idiotic, isn't it? Bauer said, with some of the kibbutznik's contempt for the seers who'd credit their pioneering courage and sacrifice to a God who supposedly needed the sacrifice of 6 million for his plan. I've just written about that, he told me. What I say is that there's no way that He stops, correcting an apparent slip, as if he was about to say Hitler when he meant to say God. But in fact, the syllogism he goes on to propose envisions God as a figure perhaps even more evil, ultimate rather than near ultimate evil. There's no way that there can be an all-powerful and just God. He can either be all-powerful or just, because if he's all-powerful, he's Satan. If he's just, he's a nebbish. God as Satan? I've rarely heard a more radical formulation of the problem of theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the existence of a supposedly loving and just God with the persistence of evil. What Bauer is saying, to unpack the assumptions compressed in his God is Satan or nebbish syllogism, is this. An all-powerful God who was just and loving would not have permitted 6 million innocents to be slaughtered for any reason, any plan. If he's all-powerful, he could have intervened, as he did on so many lesser occasions of peril in the Bible, and if he's just, he would have intervened. If he's all-powerful and permitted near-ultimate evil to prevail, 1 million children to be slaughtered virtually in front of their parents' eyes, without intervening, he might as well be Satan. Which leads us to the second element of the syllogism. If God is just, he can't be very powerful, because if he's just, he would have wanted to intervene, but just wasn't powerful enough to make a difference. He's a well-meaning but not very awesome God. A nebbish? I asked. Well, a poor chap who has to be supported, a God who needs to draw his strength from us. This is theologian Irving Greenberg's idea. And that of When Bad Things Happen to Good People author, Rabbi Kushner. It doesn't work for Bauer. I don't need a God like that. What kind of God is that, He's not an all-powerful being, he's all-present? That latter remark about an all-present God was a reference to Emil Fackenheim's tortured rationale for the absence of what Fackenheim called the commanding voice of God at Auschwitz, to Fackenheim's desire to find some presence of God in the death camps, even a silent witnessing presence. Bauer has no patience for a God who merely suffers silently with the victims. When he's there, he cries. That's very nice of him, but it doesn't help me much. He's totally superfluous. There's no one to pray to in that concept. God as Satan, or an impotent nebbish. Are these the only alternatives open to us in the aftermath of the Holocaust? In fact, there is a strain of theodicy that attempts to argue that God is neither all-powerful nor impotent, but has limited his own power to the extent necessary to give man free will, the freedom to choose good and evil. The most powerful argument for this, a contemporary symbolic logic version of G.W. Leibniz's argument that this is the best of all possible worlds consistent with individual freedom, as opposed to determinism or predestination, is the one made by the Notre Dame philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who insists that without God permitting the possibility of evil, of man choosing wrong, of what Plantinga calls trans-world depravity, that in any world in which there is freedom some will choose evil, There can be no possible world in which free will or moral choice is meaningful. But to many, the Holocaust is a challenge to the notion of the best of all possible worlds consistent with free will theodicy. Why couldn't God have created a slightly less depraved human nature? Does the necessity for trans-world depravity require a human nature so depraved that hundreds of thousands would collaborate in the murder of millions of children too young to be paying for any imagined sins? Can Auschwitz be reconciled with any best of all possible worlds theodicy that doesn't require us to question the character of God's creation, the character of God's creative impulse? Or must we resort to what is known generally as an irenic or soul-making theodicy, that catastrophic evils such as Auschwitz are painful moral lessons that God intends will lead ultimately to a less depraved human nature? Must we then say, in effect, "Thank you, God, we needed that"? Bauer is not satisfied with the alternatives to his syllogism, which merely make explicit the dramatic implications of the indictment of God that Fackenheim and other troubled believers and theologians have been wrestling with in the aftermath of Hitler. Believers like Fackenheim have been acting, in effect, as defense investigators for a silent, absent client, groping for the explanation of their client's conduct that he won't provide himself. The use of legal rhetoric, the language of trial courts, to describe this ongoing investigation is not my invention. In a survey of the debate over the Holocaust as a challenge to belief that appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion in 1989, we find the terms indictment, liability, perpetrator, complicity, aiding and abetting used in regard to God's role, as well as a remarkable line about the spectator defense of God. The spectator defense, the legal strategy used by good Germans who said they didn't participate, they only stood by while the crimes were being perpetrated, has been attacked by Elie Wiesel and others who believe those who watched passively were just as guilty of murder as those who pulled the triggers. Therefore, the spectator defense, the Academy of Religion analyst remarks, does not remove God from the dock. Emphasis added. God in the dock. On trial is not God's existence. This is, for the most part, a more interesting controversy than the old one about whether God is dead, but his character, potency, and responsibility for the malignancy, the radical evil of Adolf Hitler. What Emil Fackenheim does is attempt to vindicate a continued, if altered, Jewish relationship to God in the light of the indictment against him framed by Yehuda Bauer. Fackenheim concedes the validity of the indictment by attacking the adequacy of any other Hitler explanation, other than one that places responsibility on God's doorstep. But he does not concede the verdict. "How do you explain a person, anyway?" Fackenheim asked me after we'd settled ourselves into the patio chairs on the veranda of the small apartment in Jerusalem he shares with his second wife and their 11-year-old son. It was a hot June afternoon, and Fackenheim, then an energetic 67, was dressed in Bermuda shorts, polo shirt, and sandals, looking a bit like an American grandfather at a kosher bungalow colony. He was speaking about the attempt to explain Hitler, but in revealing bits and pieces over the course of the afternoon, Fackenheim explained his explanation by explaining some things about himself. He began with a phone call on Kristallnacht and an encounter with a playmate of Reinhard Heydrich's. On November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht, Fackenheim, then a 22-year-old student of Old Testament studies and post-Kantian philosophy at the University of Berlin, called his parents' home in the North German city of Halle. "My father had been taken," he told me. "I told my mother I was coming. I came. I reasoned that the safest place was somewhere the Gestapo had already been. I forgot that they might have tapped the wire. They listened on the phone, and the next day they came for me." "What was that like?" I asked him. "A whole squad?" "No, no," he says. "Just 2 fellows came and picked me up." They took him to Sachsenhausen, the newly constructed concentration camp outside Berlin. It was there, Fackenheim has written, the SS invented what he calls the groundwork of Auschwitz, the fictive work battalions that maintained a transparently false illusion that the camps were about work. Not that they succeeded in disguising the darker fate. The fiction was still maintained even when the secret was out, Fackenheim says, making it a Kafkaesque system in which there appeared to be meaning but was none. Thus, a clear line of development leads from Sachsenhausen in 1938 to the incredible and unprecedented legend on the gate of Auschwitz. Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. It is interesting he should single out as the essence of the cruelty of the camps the enforcement of meretricious meaning. False explanation. It was there in Sachsenhausen that his lifelong distrust of deceptive explanation was born. As an illustration of the easy, explanatory truisms he detests, he cites the commonplace sentiment about the Hitler within he encountered not long after his escape from Germany. In 1939, he'd been released from Sachsenhausen and obtained an exit visa to Canada before the doors slammed shut on the Jews in Germany. He completed rabbinical studies in Canada, and it was as a fledgling rabbi that he first encountered the Hitler within explanation. "I was asked to speak to an interfaith group about Hitler," he told me, "to support the war effort. And the thing that struck me as being pretty terrible, here we are at war, and these nice Christian ladies would come and say, 'There is a Hitler in all of us.' They'd say, 'Christians are bound to say this. When we see other people's sins, we look at our own sins.' I wanted to avoid just this," he says. "It just isn't true." It just isn't true. Fackenheim's conviction, one that he elaborates on in his theory of radical evil, is that one cannot find an explanation for the horror perpetrated by Hitler on the familiar continuum of human nature. To say that Hitler was just a very, very, very bad man, or as Alan Bullock would have it, an incompletely good one, and that some version of that same badness, one that differs only in degree, is to be found in ourselves, diminishes the radical evil Hitler represented. Such evil cannot be explained, Fackenheim insists, by his having had a very, very, very mean father, or a very, very extreme manifestation of the same inclination to evil that is in all of us. Fackenheim's strong reaction to the Hitler within argument is at the heart of what has become a radical stance that has defined one pole of the debate over explaining Hitler, that there is a radical disjuncture between human nature and Hitler nature, a disjuncture with human nature akin to the one that Fackenheim and others later came to insist obtained between the Holocaust itself and the rest of human history. Even more radical was a subsequent decision Fackenheim made: 20 years of silence. Shortly after the war, after the magnitude of the tragedy became apparent, Fackenheim decided that to speak or write about Hitler, even to mention his name, could only magnify him, give him a posthumous life. And so, for 20 years, while becoming a much-laureled professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, while publishing a much-admired synthesis of Hegelian philosophy and 20th-century Jewish theology, he maintained a determined silence on the 20th-century Jewish tragedy, believing that to discuss Hitler was somehow to perpetuate him, that to speak his name was to broadcast an incantation of radical evil. Then, in 1967, in the tense run-up to the Six-Day War, Fackenheim changed his mind and changed his life. The specter the possible destruction of the State of Israel raised of a second Holocaust convinced Fackenheim he needed to break his silence on the meaning of the first, on the implications of the radical evil it had introduced to the world. It was that year that he formulated the now widely known 614th Commandment, the single sentence for which he has become most famous, the post-Holocaust commandment regarding Hitler, which Fackenheim felt compelled to add to the traditional 613 rules of worship and conduct in the Orthodox Jewish canon. He phrased it this way: Jews are forbidden to grant posthumous victories to Hitler. Later in our conversation, he would disclose the deeper role this commandment plays in the trial of God. Back then, however, in 1967, he decided that one practical way to fulfill the mandate of the commandment was to uproot himself from his comfortable Canadian exile, move to Jerusalem, and begin to study Hitler. The immediate cause of his decision was an exchange of letters with writer Terence Desprez. Desprez is the author of The Survivor, about the experience of the death camps. I wrote him a letter in which I said, "It's a wonderful book," Fackenheim tells me, "but it's only half the story.